Okay, today's webinar is titled Critical Research Design, Quantitative and Computational Methods, or QCM, for Community Engaged Research. And we are going to be joined by Dr. Otis Johnson, who's going to introduce himself. And then once he gives his presentation, we will have our discussant to share about how this research and how the methods presented today really relate to the Administration for Children and Families work. And her name is Dr. Amanda Coleman. So she will come in after Dr. Otis Johnson finishes. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow Dr. Johnson to share his screen and begin the presentation. Thank you so much.
And I'm Otis Johnson, excited to be here to talk about critical research design and QCM methods. I'm at Johns Hopkins University, where I'm situated in a number of units. One is public health, the others are education and sociology. I'm more interested in social policy, which would be in the areas of education policy, policing, and housing policy, and of course, as it relates to health equity, health disparities, educational disparities, and really trying to make research rigorous enough to bring about sustainable change for communities of color. With that, I am Executive Director of the Institute in Critical Quantitative Computational Mixed Methods, which is one of the NSF, National Science Foundation, BICSR Institutes of Data Science, and I co-direct that with Dr. Ebony McGee, who's also here at Johns Hopkins. The overview, we're going to get into critical intersectionality methods because, of course, critical methodology is a big area. It's growing and it's an exciting area to be in right now. So I wanted to kind of focus more on one particular approach, and that would be intersectionality. But first, we'll start with a critical QCM overview. And Dr. Rollins already said that the QCM would be quantitative, computational, and mixed methods in this case. And then we'll do a little introduction to intersectionality theory. And then I have 6 approaches to critical intersectionality QCM analysis. Now, it's a mouthful, but basically, there are ways to try to get at the intersectionality effect that is theorized a lot about in critical feminist, Black feminist work. And so those theories require of us a particular methodological approach. And then after that, we'll do Q&A. So the objectives, we're going to identify at least 3 critical theoretical approaches and traditions for quantitative and computational research. We're going to understand, hopefully, the structural components of intersectionality, at least one version of that. And then we're going to name the conditions to be met for intersectionality analysis. And then also identify the strengths and weaknesses of at least 5 intersectionality approaches to QCM. And in this case, we most definitely will not get to all. Actually, there's 6, but I hope to get through 3 of them. And then if you would like, we can have access to these slides for everyone, and you can review the other 3 that we might not cover today. So when I think about critical methodology, a lot of you may have heard about QuantCrit or CritQuant, which is more of a movement within research that suggests we should be thinking about how our science occasions power and at points perpetuates marginalization. However, that QuantCrit framework has been thought to be situated within critical race theory, and Crit QCM suggests that actually there are many more framings that are critical other than critical race theory, or in addition to critical race theory, that really makes up our Crit QCM umbrella. And so when I say quantitative, I want us to know that I'm talking about statistics largely, or Bayesian approaches, which often are non-frequentist approaches to probability and expectation. Talking about computational work, which computational I like to think of as anything that can't be done by humans alone. It must be computer assisted. That includes big data and also other things such as synthetic modeling and so forth. And then, of course, data science, I'm referring here with this phrase, really the bigger, broader understanding of these methods, includes AI, machine learning, which is used in some of the work that I'll review with you today, and other neural networks, natural language processing, all of these things. And when I say mixed methods, I want us to think about mixed methods a little bit more broadly, because mixed method is just not qual comp or comp qual or quant qual. It is a lot of these other things, right? So I'm thinking about quant comp. That means quantitative computational. And the reason why I say that is because data science is really revolutionizing how we actually pursue our quantitative work, meaning that code and algorithms are now being implemented within our statistical analyses at such a pace now that it's kind of hard to keep up with the innovations and methods. I think that is also a mixed methodology. For instance, the synthetic control modeling that we're using here at Hopkins to estimate housing effects. And in this case, the synthetic control model allows us to keep highly mobile populations who may be leaving or entering neighborhoods. We synthetically keep them in place so that we can more fully estimate the effect of the actual neighborhood or the housing condition. And that's something that's assisted with computational and data science methods. Then there's also quant qual and qual quant. We know those. But then there's also qual quant comp, right? We're getting really complicated here, but natural language processing and digital humanities are really great examples of this merger between computational approaches to understanding text. So I just want us to know that mixed method now means much more than it has in the past. Now, critical positionality, when I said that is not just critical race theory, it also includes critical theory, like the post-positivist work of the critical material feminists that are really advocating for a more diffractive methodology in which we can situate statistical models alongside other ways of representing experience and behavior and thinking. There's also the strategic positivist or strategic empiricism. And we may go all the way back to Du Bois in thinking about a strategic positivist that used all of these different methods with really the belief that somehow the most compelling way to suggest we achieve racial reform and racial change is through positivism, through numbers, by showing irrefutably, as irrefutably as we can with method, why change is necessary. Then there's Afrofuturism, and this goes way back to Octavia Butler's writings, George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, right, with their futuristic look into Black life. And Derry said something that I thought was just fascinating. If you all haven't gone to the Afrofuturist exhibit at the National African American Museum of Culture and History, Derry says that Afrofuturism is the excavation of lost tomorrows. And in this vein, we think about what could have been for populations had certain events not happened. Alondra Nelson is one of those more contemporary Afrofuturist researchers that is researching not only the digital divide, but also how African American populations are using DNA to understand their past so that they may reclaim or reimagine their present and future selves. So that's just a great example of Afrofuturism. Then there's anti-colonial, decolonizing, indigenizing. which is getting to erasure and other things that happen through method. You know, the small sample situation with Native peoples in empirical work is a true problem, and indigenizing and decolonizing research would speak to some of those problems. And then there's even discrit, which is really an offshoot of critical race theory, but in disability and ability studies. So LatCrit and some others. So just wanted to suggest that there's a huge theoretical playpen out there and way to kind of understand your method. So next, I wanted to say that we use this broader foundation within ICQCM, which is the Institute for Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methods that I co-lead with Ebony McGee, who's a professor, a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor here at Johns Hopkins. We will be accepting applications for our 4th cohort coming up in April. So if you're interested in some of these opportunities, it's a 2-year affiliation. We have workshops, grant workshops. We've had great success in returns on our investment in workshop and grant workshop opportunities. We've had a 30% award rate for our last 2 cohorts. So we're really interested in working with people who want to strengthen their quantitative and computational mixed methods, especially within the context of grant working. Here are some of the seminars we have. We have indigenous data analysis, we have biomarkers and race, we have critical mixed methods, we have all of these different opportunities for people. So I just wanted to give that shameless plug because we'd love to see you apply for our next cohort. So check-in, I'm assuming we're not doing check-ins because we've already said that we will hold questions for the end, but I typically use these breaks because I'll keep talking and talking fast in order to get through the slides, but I'll keep moving. So intersectionality theory. The one reason why I felt intersectionality theory was so important to think about here with you is because it is one of the critical methodologies that it urges empirical investigation. The whole idea of having multiple social locations informing some outcome is exactly the type of theoretical framework that we might use within approaches that use categorization, right? So intersectionality and categorization are really key partners in this. By the way, I gave a 2-day training to program officers and program directors at NSF because they are now thinking about, well, actually not at the time they were thinking about, but they now have done it. They have included intersectionality as a requirement for some of their solicitations. So my training was used to train them better to operationalize that change in a lot of their solicitation and review processes. So let's get going. Intersectionality is an outgrowth of Black feminist theory. Intersectionality recognizes that African-American women's experience is more fully understood when viewed through the lens of multiple systems of oppression, primarily those of race, gender, social class. And while a lot of people will credit Kimberly Crenshaw for intersectionality, I like to go back to Audre Lorde, who theorized difference decades ago and talked about the experiences of being raced, being gendered, and being sexualized within opportunity structures or even in opportunity structures of power and marginalization. Then Corbato wrote in '99 that intersectional oppression of men of color too should be examined. I concur with that. Crenshaw remarked, as long as such recognition does not elevate their plight over that of women in anti-oppression discourse and work. So here we already have some of the tenets of intersectionality being put forth, and some of us would like to hear more closely to them, whereas I think research has taken intersectionality into a space where interaction term all of a sudden means intersectionality. And I'm not for that. That is not what I believe to be the case with intersectionality theory. So we can do intersectional analyses, but if we're going to do intersectionality analyses, then I think we need to be more closely aligned with theory. So just so we know what oppression is, I think we all know what it is, but it's important to understand that it includes power in it, okay? And power is one of the key points of interest of intersectionality theory. In this case, power could be, group oppression, it could be even, social. But here it also can be governmental, it could be cultural, it could be prejudice. And so we should keep that in mind as we move forward, because some things, though we might think we're using the intersectionality lens, if it is not about these things, marginalization, power, prejudice, culture, then you might be doing something other than intersectionality. So let's kind of deconstruct intersectionality from a structural component perspective. Here I have intersectionality, and a lot of times we think of intersectionality according to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, and language. So I have that there for you. But I often see in work people thinking about intersectionality from the standpoint or viewpoint of the person, meaning it's an identity. And I'll say perhaps, yes. But I, I also think that the Black feminist theoretical position is also about how they are positioned, right? Not only how they think of themselves, but their actual social location. And so it's not just how you view yourself, but how others view you. So intersectionality is identity and social location. Then there's a balancing act. I am cisgender, Black, probably higher income, but I might think of my gender more important or more frequently throughout the day than I do my race, or I might think about my sexual orientation more frequently than I think about my language. Um, so there's a balance, right, to how you understand yourself and your how you're situated in the midst of all of these social locations. Then there's, see, you have city on one side, you have probably rural setting on the other. That suggests that perhaps you might think about these identifiers such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and age differently according to where you are physically located. So now you have your identity, you have your social location, and you have your physical location. And time, right? Some people are like, well, what do you mean by time? Well, just think if you are a Black woman in a city at nighttime, um, you might, not think as much about your race as you might your gender, right? Whereas if you're a man and it's nighttime, you might be cued to think more about your race. So here we have time factoring in to how you think about yourself and how others think about you, right? Because at nighttime, if you decide that you're going to go for a jog and you're a Black male in a particular neighborhood, you might think differently about yourself and be thought of differently if you had done that during the daytime. So we have all these different intersectional components that then vary according to all of these things that I just mentioned. But the one other component that I think we must understand is that intersectionality is an externality. What do I mean by that? I mean, if I'm Black and gay, then there is something that occurs net of that intersection. There is a way in which I'm looked at. In other words, these things are not just intersecting in a additive way that I have, yes, an age and a disability. They are multiplicative, synergistic for some people, where all of a sudden this intersection explains more than could be explained by the subcomponents in isolation, right? So Black might get you this, gender might get you this, but when you do Black woman, you get something much different than both. So intersectionality is an externality. And there are some methods then that would allow you to actually estimate that externality, meaning that you must have the main effects of race and ethnicity in your model. Then you would have an interaction term to get at the externality, what's net of that intersection. I think that's really important, right? Because that's what intersectionality is saying. It is saying that I'm not just a woman, I'm not just Black, I am a Black woman. And that is something much different than either of those two designations alone. So intersectionality, theoretical structure then. So I think we now can kind of bring all this together, right? There's identity, there's social location, there's the primacy and balance, right? Which one is prime, which is secondary, tertiary, and the balance of those things. There's time and place, and then there's the synergistic externality, which could bring about possible dissonances too, because we can't assume all those social locations or components in your matrix here are similarly valenced, right? They're not all positive, they're not all negative, they sometimes counteract. So if anyone asks you what is the theoretical structure, at least as far as this empirical model is concerned, I would say that these are the things that make intersectionality within QCM analyses. And I'm so happy to hear from you all later about possible variations of this. That would be great too. Okay, so one other thing I have always mentioned, there's a tendency within normative work to say that the outcome is the outcome. And who cares about the epistemologies that we bring to our work? I like to have the more critical posture of QCM work in general, and to always suggest that we rephrase the way we think about things and the assumptions, make sure we are clear in our assumptions about the relationships we're talking about and the populations and the culture, right? Be culturally relevant with your interpretation and inferences. So just know that intersectionality analysis should not be deficit promoting. So if you want to do an intersection analysis about Black males being more violent than everyone else, then that's not intersectionality, because you have missed the most important point, which is to understand power relations within your work. So again, intersectionality by definition cannot be deficit promoting, or either you're not doing intersectionality. So, moving on. Again, I would check in here for questions and comments, but I'm going to move forward. I want to suggest that there are, and I'm sure there are others, but I have framed this, what would otherwise be a 2-day training, I mean, of multiple hours, like 8 hours. I've framed it in terms of 6 different intersectional or intersectionality analysis approaches. One would be data disaggregation, another would be dummies, interaction terms, structural equation modeling, path analysis, deductive intersectional inferences or intersectionality inferences, and multi-level analysis of individual heterogeneity and discriminatory accuracy. And that's like the new thing that's out. Relatively new. It was first published in 2017, 2018. So people are now using Meta as a way to get at intersectionality. I'm only going to go over probably the data disaggregation. I'll go over the interaction terms. I think people know a lot about the dummies, so I probably won't hit on that. And I'll probably do the deductive intersectionality inferences. Again, I have the dummy structural equation modeling and meta in this analysis for people who would like to look at it later by going through the slides. So, um, so I've tried all of these approaches, and so I have the references here, and I have to say all of them have pluses and minuses. So we're going to critique all of this. First thing is I want to share with you the framing, and the framing was about social control. And when I say social control here, I'm thinking about how a group or society brings about social order. Oftentimes, this is through internalized um, uh, processes of self-regulation, right? Where through stigma, shame, fear of ostracization, you kind of adopt the normative behavioral posture and belief systems. Think about your neighborhood watch group as an informal social control because you all have collectively decided that safety is important in your neighborhood. And so you've decided to do something about it to get everybody sensitized to watching your neighborhood and for strangers. Now, there's formal social control, and formal social control would be the state apparatuses, laws, governments, institutional regulation that actually kind of demands conformity, obedience, and it socializes you to do so. And at times when you don't adopt or stray from these more normative behaviors, coercion is used. And so this is where you get the police and all these other things involved. And so I've been really interested in social control in terms of intersectionality. Lots of ways in which social control is operationalized is through surveillance and technologies, is through cultural policing for kids, like their dress code and what our brother in Texas is going through right now, Daryl George, I believe, who's been kicked out of school basically for having locks and refusing to cut them. Is SRO, is armed law enforcement in your neighborhoods, in your schools, so forth. I'm not going to go through all of these because we want to get to the actual demonstrations. So one of the problems, though, is that schools have started to rely on these approaches, right, to order uh, by using law enforcement. And so here you see that in San Bernardino from 2005 to 2014, there was about 7,000 minors arrested on the streets, but over 30,000 within schools, suggesting that schools are becoming the way in which the majority of the incarcerated population first experience law enforcement and criminal justice. This approach is even being expanded, right? Now we're getting into facial recognition software within our nation's schools. And so this brings about racial disparities, and it begins early. It brings about intersectional disparities in particular. So here, boys receive more than 3 out of 4 out-of-school preschool suspensions, and there are 42 of those, 42% of those suspended once, 48% of those suspended more than once. And then it continues all the way up what we call that school to prison pipeline until we get to referrals and arrest in high school, where you see again big disparities for boys of color, primarily in arrests. And then for girls, here we see that Black girls actually have the largest within gender gap, within gender racial gap of all intersection possibilities. Their gap is larger relative to with white girls than Black boys are to white boys, for example. So very large, prominent within gender racial gap. Again, it's begging for intersectional analysis. And so here we'll start with just one, and I'm going to hope to get through these in 5 to 7 minutes, and then we could turn this over. the next speaker. This one is data disaggregation. Really simple. We've all done this. In essence, we have a full sample and we separate it into subsamples based on intersectional components. We have Black males, Latinas, or indigenous males. And we can tease out effects for two or more intersectional subcomponents, right? Race, gender, ethnicity, gender, whatever the other categories may be. But the limitations is that it lowers statistical power to detect latent effects. There's no shared slope for analyzing power relations, and it does not expose externalities. And so let me just move more into the power part of this, because I think people need to get this. Power is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when a specific alternative hypothesis may be true. And in this case, we really run this risk within educational research because the effect sizes there tend to be smaller than other social domains. And then education is naturally clustered. You know, there are kids within classrooms that are within schools, within neighborhoods, all that sort of thing. The point is that at some point, our sampling might actually include more people than we actually need and then drive the price up of the actual cost per participant within research. Or we could sample too few and run the risk of not having enough statistical power to detect those effects after we've disaggregated the sample. So I want you to know that there's a way around this. You can know beforehand, before you submit that proposal to ACF, that you can estimate your power. And so I want you to go to the William T. Grant Foundation site. You can get the optimal design software. This link is active. It take you right to their site. In the second box here, you can download it. And then there's the documentation as well. And it helps you estimate relationships like this. So here we have an output, and I'll just explain it real quickly. You want to achieve a power level of 0.8. And I have a little blue line there where you can see the power level. Now here is a cluster randomized trial, and you also have your delta. Your delta on the I guess right side, you'll see 0.25, then you'll see 0.35, 35, then 0.40, 0.40. And those are at the significance levels of 0.5, 0.05, or 0.10, right? And so what this does, this depiction tells you how many clusters you need and how many people in the clusters you need in order to detect an effect size of either 0.25, 0.35, or 0.40 at those particular levels of significance. And so two things I want you to understand here or take away is that at some point, your return in power starts to level off. So you don't need to sample every person in that classroom. You're actually driving up the price of your research without any return to power. But then also the other thing is that it tells you exactly how many people you do need per cluster in this case. So I'm just offering this to let you know that this is possible with that software, and it's free and is really intuitive, and the guide is wonderful too. I would check in here, but I think we're going to move forward with the next. I think we're going to make it. Approach 2 is the interaction term. And there are a few things we need to understand here. Social mobility and context of heterogeneity suggests that places that are diverse are not panaceas for people of color. And so you'll see what I'm talking about later on. We want to know how big is the effect of being suspended in a white context versus a Black context. We also know that stratification within these schools is higher. in heterogeneous schools because middle class families demand it. They'll say, "Oh, this school is not safe," and the principal will respond by suspending more people. And then later, the suspension rate will be the same thing that drives those white families away, right? It's like they demand more suspension, you give it to them, and then they use it against you to actually leave. Then there's opportunity hoarding, and then there's defensive inequality privilege. And both of those are suggesting that within these heterogeneous neighborhoods and schools, we find this positioning and use of power to get more resources and opportunity. So we have these questions. I am not going to read them all. I want to move forward because I know we're lower on time than we need to be. But I do want to share with you the overall approach here. What we did was we wanted to understand how Black kids who have been suspended, how their academic performance and self-efficacy changed and I mean changed relative to Black kids who were not suspended as the percentage of white kids went up in their schools, right? So we're talking about the Black gap, non-suspended versus suspended, in schools that vary in their racial composition. We use machine learning to actually equalize the probabilities of being in these types of schools, right? Whether you're in a majority Black school versus a majority white school. And then we used interaction terms to actually get at your race by composition interaction. So variables with interaction terms interact when one influences the effect of the other. Therefore, in analyses where the interacting variables are estimated in isolation, it becomes problematic to interpret the effect of one of the interacting variables while the other is held constant. So this basically is saying that you need to have your main effects in the model, meaning race and gender, for example, plus the interaction term to understand how the two really interact. I'm talking about that synergistic quality, externality that we talked about in our intersectionality theorizing. And so here I've put that, not going to go through this. I wanted it in here for those who needed to see this because this sometimes really helps when you include it in your grant proposal. And this is what we found. So if you look at this far left box, you see the Black sample. And here we did disaggregate, but we have a very large sample of over 5,000. And plus, we have a pooled sample as well so that you can have a shared slope to understand. These are the marginal estimates. And we actually show that for Black kids who have been suspended, that's the red line, their math outcomes are really no different than the Black kids who have not been suspended, which is the blue line. But as the percentage of white enrollment increases, you actually see that math score decline to the point where it's lower for kids who have been suspended, and it is significantly lower. So in the middle, that's showing you for the whole sample, the same is the case, but it apparently is only because of the Black kids in the sample having that experience, because for white kids, it is not significant. So while it looks like a much larger gap here in the white sample, it is actually insignificant, and point-wise is actually smaller. So we were like, hey, that's that social location perhaps, but maybe it's something about identity. Maybe it's something internal. Maybe it's psychosocial, right? And so we looked at math efficacy to try, because that would be one of those indicators. And so here we find with the whole sample that, there's possibly a difference here. It was a very weak magnitude, but nonetheless, The white sample showed a little farther, a little higher drop off, I guess. I hate to use higher drop off, but the difference is bigger. Black sample, far right, we actually see that the efficacy scores of those who have been suspended is pretty high. And that by the end of the transition from no white kids in the school to 100% white kids in school, it does fall, but it doesn't remain, it isn't significant. So what that is saying is that whatever we observed with the math performance drop off is not because kids were feeling that they couldn't do math, right? That math drop off for Black kids who have been suspended relative to those Black kids who were not really was likely due to the changing percentage of white kids. And you'd be like, well, what does that mean? You know? Heterogeneity interacts with social control, right? Use of social control strategies as response to the racialization of students, meaning there might be some defense of white privilege going on here, meaning that perhaps Black kids who are within those majority white contexts that are perceived to have been misbehaving are thought of as more serious threats or are deprived of other educational resources and opportunities that end up really impacting their performance. And while segregation gathers Black students together to more efficiently deliver inequities to the greatest number of them within segregated neighborhoods and schools, contexts of heterogeneity are not an escape, right? There's a precision to white racism where it is not an escape to be in context of whiteness when you think policy should have pretty common effects, at least not differing according to race. So yes, you can be concentrated so that you can experience race more efficiently and oppression according to that, but then also be strategically and with some precision exposed to the similar forces within heterogeneous groups. So we found no evidence of oppositional identity here. So benefits of interaction terms, estimate effects net of main effects. So there are externalities here, including analysis along with the term. Retains the full sample and shared slope, is not limited to categorical or dichotomous main effects. Limitations, terms are hard to interpret, usually use marginal estimates. And oftentimes, if you can't really interact a whole bunch of things, right? They become more difficult to interpret as you add more things, like race, ethnicity, and gender, for example, which meta, by the way, we do. We have an analysis where meta will give us as many social locations to intersect and estimate outcomes as we dream of. It's a quite powerful approach. It also requires more power. So I'm editor of the Sociology of Education Journal, and I got this submission that had at least, I counted, I think it was like over 23 interaction terms in one model. And most people are unaware that you need roughly 16 times the sample size of a main effect analysis to estimate each interaction term. You can't just throw all these interaction terms in the model. And I'm quite surprised that it would even converge, but even if it does, it's, there's no way you can make sense of the model either. So just be aware that interaction terms have limitations as well when you're thinking about doing intersectionality work. And so I'm going to stop here and say, yes, there's more we could talk about. I have many, many more in this slide deck. I'm so happy to share them with you, and I hope we have a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. If you stop sharing your
Yeah,
screen,
sure.
I'll pull up Dr. Coleman's slides.
Okay. Okay. Well, I know we're short on time, so I'm going to just jump right in. First, I just want to thank Dr. Johnson for that wonderful presentation. There is definitely a wealth of great information that you shared, and it sounds like even more in the slide deck that we didn't get to cover today. But I know I, for one, am still processing everything you shared, and hopefully if folks are able to stay on, we will have maybe some time for you all to share a few reflections and questions. So my role today is to reflect a bit on the relevance of what Dr. Johnson has shared for research and evaluation on human services programs, particularly those administered by the Administration for Children and Families, which is where I sit. And I also want to spend some time thinking about the relevance for research on the populations that are served. Next slide, please. Okay, this is good. There's a little bit of animation on this slide, but I'll indicate when to click. So before I talk about my reflections, I think it's important to share a bit about the lens that I'm bringing and how that might be shaping some of the reflections that I share. So I sit within the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Again, OPRE is situated within the Administration for Children and Families, an agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And ACF is responsible for federal programs that promote the economic and social well-being of families, children, individuals, and communities. And many of those we serve have been marginalized from social and economic opportunities. ACF includes 10 different program offices that administer a dozen of different programs, such as Head Start, child care subsidies, temporary assistance for needy families, Title IV-E child welfare programs. And across these programs, we serve a range of different populations. So next animation, yes, perfect. So within ACF, OPRE plays an important role in conducting research and evaluation in partnership with ACF program offices. And our role is to build and disseminate knowledge about effective approaches to strengthen ACF programs that touch various populations. And we primarily do this through evaluations of existing programs using innovative approaches. We also conduct research synthesis, descriptive and exploratory studies, and most of our research is conducted through contracts awarded to research firms, but we also do award grants to academic researchers. We also provide guidance, technical assistance to ACF programs on research evaluation, measurement, strategic planning, and we also more broadly work to improve the quality, usefulness, and sharing of data on ACF programs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as you may know, there has been a really big focus and a growing focus in the government on advancing equity for populations that have been marginalized. And this focus recognizes that different groups experience different opportunities based on their race, other aspects of identity, social location. These different opportunities are really rooted in inequitable policies and practices that are entrenched in our public and private institutions. And so accepting that as the research arm of ACF, OPRE, it is critical that we infuse equity into how we conduct our research and evaluation. And for us, centering equity in our work means taking into account the broader systems and structures that I mentioned that create inequities. We have to do this in both our research, in terms of the research questions we ask, the data we collect, but we also need to bring a critical lens to the traditional methods and approaches that we use to guide our research that have been shaped by these same inequitable systems and structures. We also, for us, this means designing our research to permit useful and meaningful data disaggregation, doing this in ways that do not harm marginalized communities and truly help us deepen our understanding of their experiences. We also, for us, this means involving communities impacted by our work in the research process, and also recognizing the positionality of members of our research teams and how that shapes our work. So what I greatly appreciated about Dr. Johnson's work and presentation, and particularly the focus on intersectionality, is that it really showcases the ways we can begin to deepen our understanding of factors outside of the individuals, how our systems and structures contribute and work together to produce inequities. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now that I've kind of given you a little bit of information about sort of ACF and the vantage point that I'm bringing, I want to kind of run through a few takeaways from my perspective. These are more so sort of summaries of some of what we heard today. So the first, I think, and one very, very, I think, important takeaway is just the reminder that the research methods and approaches we use are grounded in very specific ways of thinking and understanding the world, and that these approaches are embedded within larger social and structural contexts. I think Dr. Johnson's presentation really emphasized the importance of taking a critical perspective to the conduct of research. I think he really showed us how we can situate our statistical models against or alongside theoretical approaches that are aimed at justice. He also grounded his work in a very specific example, so intersectionality. And he really showed us that intersectionality is more than just considering the fact that people have multiple identities, right? It's a framework that recognizes, for marginalized groups in particular, the multiple identities, social location, other factors such as time, place, balance really can result in unique synergistic combinations, forms, and experiences of oppression. He reminded us that intersectionality is rooted in justice and must be anti-oppressive through its focus on structural inequity and power relations. It really does allow us to link research, data work, and scholarship to justice and equity. So really using our research for change. And importantly, if it's not being used with that lens, if it's deficit promoting, then you're not really doing or using an intersectional framework. And the last kind of takeaway or summary kind of for me was that there are multiple methods and approaches for examining intersectionality in your analyses. So he made it concrete how we can move beyond theory to be able to operationalize and examine intersectionality quantitatively. He nicely outlined for us that each approach has its strengths and limitations. And I think his work is really helping us stretch our thinking and how we use our quantitative methods. So very, very powerful. Next slide. And this is my last slide. And it's just, I kind of put some questions up here that I think are important reflections for both ACF in terms of our work and the work of our partners. It's sort of beginning to get us thinking about kind of, again, the application of Dr. Johnson's work for the work of ACF. And I think most importantly, it's really looking at what steps have we taken to reimagine the ways we conduct research and where do we need to still make progress. Again, bringing a critical lens to the way that we've been conducting research within the federal government and outside of the federal government. There are also questions about how well we are even considering intersectionality, both in the way that we administer programs in ACF, as well as our research and evaluation. The next question is very simply, what identities and social locations are particularly relevant to the population served by ACF? And for me, this question in particular really emphasizes the importance of community engagement. How are we seeking and hearing directly from the populations we serve about what identities and experiences really matter to capture in our work? And lastly, how do we set up our studies to collect appropriate data to be able to examine intersectionality? What data do we need to collect? How do we collect it? How do we weigh the strengths and limitations of the various approaches that Dr. Johnson laid out? I think for OPRE in particular, these questions are essential because not only do we often collect data in OPRE to analyze it, to support our program partners, but we also make a lot of our data available for secondary analysis by researchers in the field. So the decisions we make about what to collect really do matter. So that kind of concludes my reflections, and I guess I'll turn it back over to Dr. Rollins.
Thank you both so very much for your presentations and for all of the information shared. It's extremely helpful. We do have one question, Dr. Johnson, in the chat. It says it's very challenging to get individual level data for TANF or other program participants. So how do you suggest we apply the methods you just discussed to ecological studies? And Dr. Johnson, you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I have not done TANF work, so but nonetheless share your pain about individual level data in general. You know, we tend not to have the information that matters most for African American and Black populations. It's uh, just one of the things that I've been working on in terms of data policy, and that's um, really my effort to shape data availability through engagement with direct engagement with agencies, either as member of their external advisory boards or expert panels in some way. And so I do that quite a bit. I hope many of you also engage the federal government about their data collection to tell them exactly what measures you need. I did that recently when the director of NCES was speaking, and I took that microphone and said, hey, you all stopped using your facilities checklist in your national longitudinal studies. Now we're kind of blind to the surveillance infrastructures of these schools. We have no way to link it to individual performances. So yes, you need to be vocal about the data you need with those who collect data. I'm not saying they're always amenable to hearing from people, but I don't know that we do that enough. I don't know that we literally reach out to either NIJ or even ACF and say, listen, these are the data we need. Beyond those who are, privileged and on those expert panels that often don't reflect all the populations who could benefit from greater data availability. And you asked, how do you suggest we apply the methods in ecological studies? And so I don't know if I'm understanding exactly what is meant by ecological studies, but if you think about ecosystems, they have many points in which factors relate to particular opportunities, outcomes, behaviors, what have you. If you think about ecosystems as social locations, right, or either components of those constellation of factors, we should be interested in how we measure that. How do we model those relationships among those parts of the ecological framework? But then also, how do we understand the cumulative impact or situational impact they may have on outcomes? That's been a big question of mine, and right now I'm doing that kind of work with on systemic racism and trying to understand it as an ecological um, uh, phenomena, and we commit what we call the Durkheimian ecological fallacy every time we infer from individual level measures something that caused it at a different unit of analysis. You might say structural racism or systemic racism, and really we've never measured the systemic racism or the structural racism. We really only have this racial trauma scale, right? And we'll say that it's due to racism, but we've never measured systemic or structural racism. We've inferred that it exists, like it's in the air, from some individual level experience. And so I'm trying now to actually measure three types of racism: structural, systemic, and cultural, to at the point at which they occur, as opposed to it as an outcome of some individual level. So I guess another answer to your question is sometimes we need to leave the individual level data alone and get to understand systems and structures better as well. And I think that's where my work is heading, trying to really get at systems and structures.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. You have two more questions. The next one is, could a critical quantitative approach be used to understand within group relations? So for example, Black family differences in opportunity due to income, or is the purpose mainly for between group comparisons?
I think that's a great question. And I would say definitely within group relations, because we often are constrained in the behaviors or opportunities within our group because of outside forces. Power still informs what happens even within Black communities among Black and African American people. So no, you don't really need to think about comparative or stratification, social stratification perspective on everything. We could be just looking at Black populations, right? Doing work there instead of always having to compare it to some other group. But nonetheless, understand that whatever happens within that context is due to the broader system of relations, right? The broader power structure, the broader opportunity structure. So I'm a big fan, actually, of single race analyses. But at the same time, I do not drink the Kool-Aid about somehow stratification research being inherently deficit, because you know, we can't see, as Bell Hooks said, you know, getting rid of those categories is ceding to power, the very things that are undermining us. We need to know those things and how they function, because once we become blind to them, that doesn't mean they've stopped seeing us or losing their focus on us.
Awesome. Mr. Howard says, thank you for the presentations. He says, Dr. Johnson, of the 6 approaches, is there one that seems most promising for the study of complex topics and actionable recommendations, such as social policies? Or should we be centering more the overall research designs and availability of primary or secondary data?
So part of it, and I did not go into the deductive inferences approach. We're going to need all these approaches, and I don't know that the deductive inferences approach is, you know, the way to go even for small n. And just to give everyone a brief summary of it, we all know that most shootings by police of Black individuals is of males. 97% of those shot are male. So, but you know, someone like me who's interested in saying her name, I also said, what do we do about the Black women and women in general who have also been shot? How do we understand that experience, even though people might think, oh, it's infrequent. It's still not immaterial. It's still not irrelevant. So what I did was I estimated the probability or odds of being shot when you're Black for Black males. Then I did the same thing and estimated this, the same model for Black race, meaning anyone who's Black, knowing that the difference between the estimates would be because of the addition of women to the racial analysis, right? So Black male analysis, then full race analysis, Black race analysis, knowing that the difference in the estimates are due to the inclusion of Black women. And I found that the odds of being shot while unarmed for Black populations went up by a factor of 2. I was like, wait a minute, that can't be right. And so I went in and I found that of all the race gender intersections, Black women was the only one for which the majority of them killed by police, in which the majority of them were killed by police when unarmed, right? So my point here is we wouldn't know that without that particular approach, even though, because, we just didn't have enough Black women to do its own analysis or disaggregate, to put in the gender term wouldn't really make sense either with so few. But it did cause me to discover that there was a disproportionality there that didn't exist for any other race gender intersection. So I think all of these are needed. We need a toolkit, basically, I guess is the answer, to unearth the information that we ask. With methods shouldn't be the obstacle to learning about social phenomena. There is always a way. I just have kind of, there are some limitations to all those ways, but there's always a way. But the other one I would say is Meta. Meta is allowing us to look at very low frequency count intersection cells, so we had this most recent analysis where we had gay and Asian coming up as a group. Now we ended up having to get rid of, it's a Bayesian approach. So the low cell size wasn't a problem in this analysis as much as it was of deductive disclosure, right? We didn't want to have that possibility of disclosing or deductively identifying who that was. But Meta is going to allow you to do as many intersections as you want, and then to do so with even low cell counts of particular intersections. So it is a very powerful tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat right now 2 references to Meta that so you can kind of look up the studies. And so I'm doing it right now before everyone logs off. So, and again, these references are also in the presentation slides, but I'm going to send this right now. There you go. So you have 2 references for Meta.
Awesome. We have one more question. Thanks for the presentations and explanation, Dr. Johnson. Have you heard of measures like the index of race-related stress, and can it be a good capture for systemic racism as we understand it?
So I can't say that I'm familiar with the index of race-related stress. My concern with any scale indice is that if it's because of individuals, right, then you are taking individual perspective on something that is of another unit of analysis. I'm trying to stress this point with all of my colleagues because we're now, we have these communities now that are um, forming over this, this estimation of measurement first, and then estimation of systemic structural racism. And my point, this is a great example. So when we all bought into the William Julius Wilson work about, the what happens when jobs disappear in neighborhoods, and everyone was using the unemployment measure within their measures of social disorganization, which, I kind of rejected. But everyone was using it, and instead, what they should have been using are measures of the actual job availability in the neighborhoods, not the people who were unemployed, but what type of jobs were available and how many were available within the proximity. That's the measure of the system, of structure, of opportunity. Instead, they took these measures of individuals who did or did not have jobs and inferred that somehow we were going through this macroeconomic deindustrialization and jobs were disappearing and blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying that none of that happened. What I'm saying is the effect of it was never measured. What was measured was people's responses to that happening, right? Their job-seeking behaviors, their actual wages, all these things. Great proxies for it, but we just never measured it. Now, people who did the later, like Michael Stoll and others, the economists, actually did end up looking at, skills and spatial mismatch. And so that is about the actual structure. But for some reason, the sociologists and all of us in education and so forth were kind of oblivious to us actually needing to measure the structure.
Okay. One last question. Is there a good measure for perceived discrimination?
Oh, there's so many. A good one. How do you define good? So, uh, gosh, who am I thinking about? Not Sue, but, so there's racial trauma, there's, so, okay, yeah, we'd have to talk about this one. Because, I mean, so discrimination could mean so many different scales. I'm thinking about the Gerald Sue one. I'm thinking about the one that came after that. There's the implicit bias scale. So it depends on how you're really defining discrimination. There's the microaggression scale. I know Ebony McGee, who I work with here, does a lot of work in microaggressions and uses some of these scales. So there's just so when you say discrimination, there's a whole bunch of scales out there. I just don't know how to say good, right? Because all of them have some they have their scale parameters. They have, reliability. They have measures of shared variance and or variation that they account for, their eigenvalues, the KMO. They have all of that that suggests they predict what they're supposed to, right? But and many of them have, been normed on Black populations. So I've got to give them that credit too. So I would say there are lots of good ones, I guess is my answer, unless you meant something else by good.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for sharing your expertise in QCM. And Dr. Coleman, thank you for giving your perspective on how this relates to ACF and the research that is being conducted there, and particularly in OPRE. You all please take our survey and let us know your thoughts about this webinar, and be sure to look on our website, naacfrc.org. You will find the recording and slides for this. You'll also be able to register for the next month's presentation. So again, thank you all so much for your time, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a great one.
Thank you.
You too.
Mhm.